So the reason of this interview is because obviously you have a great, interesting story, interesting career, successful one, interesting life, and you just published a book, Warrior, My Path to Being Brave. And I want to ask you what was behind this book, because you were an actress, a model, a football silent reporter, actress, and now one of the top investigative reporters in the country.
So thank you for that. The reason that I wrote the book is that I wanted to leave behind some real help, some suggestions for some women that are considering a career in journalism or entertainment or sports. My book is both a cautionary tale and a love letter for young women, because in my career, I achieved a lot of success, but I also faced a lot of challenges. And a lot of the mistakes I made were avoidable. And so I talk very openly and honestly about what I wish I would have done differently so that other women won't make some of the same mistakes that I made. And the reason I called the book Warrior, as you know, Guerrero, my last name, means warrior in Spanish. And my mother was a Chilean immigrant. And before she died of lymphoma when she was 29 and I was 8 years old, she pulled me aside and she said, Lisita, never forget that you are a guerrero, and guerrero means warrior. You were born to fight. Then she passed away, but I didn't know what that meant when I was 8 years old. So it took me an entire career to discover that I am a warrior, that I am a guerrero, that I am exactly where I'm supposed to be, helping other people today. But it took me a long time to learn how to unleash my inner warrior.
Beautiful words, Lisa. Tell me about your mother. What you remember of those days with your mother who immigrated from Chile to the US?
The first thing I remember about her, honestly, was her beauty. I think every child believes their mother is beautiful. And I know that my mother was beautiful in many ways. She was beautiful inside, and she was strong, and she was brave. But she was also really physically gorgeous. She looked like an exotic actress or a model, or so people used to say she looked like Sophia Loren. But she was very physically beautiful, but she was also fierce. She was very, very proud of her heritage. She was proud of her name. She was proud of her journey, her family's journey from Chile to the United States. Her father was a tailor for the Salvation Army and was sponsored by a Salvation Army officer to come to Chicago to make uniforms for the Salvation Army. And he started out by making $75 a week, and he ended up working his way up and at one point owning his own company called the Chicago Uniform Company, which was a massive success. And he went on to employ 120 immigrants in Chicago. Later, when he came to California, he was a Salvation Army, as I told you, Salvation Army soldier. When he was in Chicago, he opened the second ever Hispanic ministry for the Salvation Army in the Midwest. And when he moved to Los Angeles, he opened 4 Hispanic ministries for the Salvation Army in Los Angeles that still exist today and are still working to benefit and to serve the people of Los Angeles, the immigrant community here, the Latino community in Los Angeles. So my grandfather, Raul Guerrero, was somebody that was definitely a role model for me and my mother. So I come from a proud lineage of Chileans that have come to this country to succeed and to hope that their children succeed as well.
Well, so the Guerrero energy still helps the city of LA and the surroundings. So you were talking about your mother, and you were saying that she was, a strong woman. And is there an example that you can share with us about her fierceness and the way that influenced you?
Yes, in my book, Warrior, I write about one of the things that I remember most about her. We were in a store called Pier One, and I was 7 or 8 years old. It was probably shortly before she died. She was at the cash register and she was trying to return an item. And there was a line behind us of other women. And as my mother was speaking to the cashier, my mother had an accent, of course. She, English was her second language. And she was very articulate and she knew English, but she had an accent. But the woman behind us, this blonde, big woman, was furious with my mother. And finally, she said to my mother, "Go back to Mexico." And my mother stiffened up. I could see the back of her. I was little and she was tall. To me, she was tall. And she stiffened her back up and she swung around and her black hair swung around and she faced down this woman. And she said, "Lady, I'm from Chile, not Mexico. That's not even the same continent, you ignorant woman." And then she grabbed my arm and we marched out of that store, and she was shaking in the parking lot with rage. But it's the first time I had ever seen real racism in my life. And to see my mother not shy away from it, not back down and not apologize. Instead, she demanded that that woman understand who she was, where she was from, and that it was the woman who was ignorant, not my mother. So I never forgot that. She is a warrior. She's always been that in my mind. But I thought that showed a lot of courage. Now we hear about those incidents all the time in the news, right? These Karens, they call them Karens. But my mother was the first person that I had ever seen stand up for herself like that.
Mhm. Lisa, you have achieved a lot of recognition and awards in your journalistic career. We will get to that in a moment, but I want to go back to 20 years ago, 25 years ago, when you were a sports journalist in Southern California, and when you had this what you call traumatic experience doing the silent reporter reporting for Monday Night Football. What happened when you were doing this? This job as a silent reporter in football?
So for many years, I had been a sports reporter here in Los Angeles. I started at CBS2, worked my way up to Fox 11 and then Fox Sports Net to a show called The Best Damn Sports Show, period. So I had spent a decade covering sports in Los Angeles. When I was hired on the biggest stage in sports, which was Monday Night Football on ABC, a lot of critics didn't know me. They weren't familiar with me because I didn't come from New York or ESPN. And they looked at me as just a model or an actress or a cheerleader. And they dismissed the decade of work that I had done to get to that point. So I was the subject of a lot of unfair criticism at the time. And I think part of it was even, racially motivated in a way. I think for me to have the last name Guerrero, to look how I look, to have long hair, and to have a glamorous presentation on camera is part of what my mom looked like. It's part of my heritage. I think Latinas are more comfortable with their sexuality and femininity in many ways than other women are. And I was very confident and secure in that. And I think that bothered some of the mainstream American media when they reported about me. So I made a mistake on the first regular season game for Monday Night Football after the game, which I quickly corrected live on the air. But because of that mistake, it gave all of the critics all the ammunition they needed to say, "See, she's just a bimbo. She's just a pretty face. She doesn't know sports." And that, in addition to having a boss who yelled at me, was very verbally abusive to me, really started a downward spiral for me. I became depressed. I became anxious. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't eat. I was scared I was going to get fired every single day. I was scared to make a mistake. And eventually I had a miscarriage on the sideline of Monday Night Football in front of 40 million people that didn't know it. I was suffering a miscarriage. I went into the official's bathroom at halftime And sure enough, I had been bleeding. But instead of calling an ambulance, instead of telling my producer I'm having a medical emergency, I covered it up. I ignored the pain, and I went out to report on the second half of the game because I was so afraid of the criticism I was receiving. I thought they were going to fire me for this, and I was ashamed of it. I was full of shame. And eventually I was fired after that season. And that following year was horrible. I still was depressed and I was embarrassed. I thought I had brought shame to my family's name. I thought I hadn't lived up to my name, Guerrero. I didn't feel like I was a warrior. And I almost killed myself that next year. I almost drove off PCH. And instead, I called my dad. I pulled over to the side of the road and I called my dad. And I said, Dad, I have to tell you about what's really going on with me. And for the first time ever, I was honest with him and I told him about my depression and the pain I was feeling. And that was the first step to my recovery, was reaching out to my dad and then talking to a therapist. But that entire journey the end of my sports career was extremely painful and traumatic. But I write about it in my book because I want people to know that there is somebody on the receiving end of criticism or verbal abuse or trolling on social media or yelling. When you yell at somebody, there's somebody that's absorbing that. And those consequences could be deadly. And that's why I write about it in such detail in my book.
Thank you so much for your incredible testimony. Sorry for all this depression and struggle you had to go through, but I think all what you are doing is incredible, educational and helpful for society, especially in these times. And things have changed happily and it needs to be keep changing and improving. But thank you so much for your honesty and your testimony, incredible testimony. But then this turning point and the beginning of an incredible journalistic journey. And you have been able to resolve big cases, dramatic criminal cases, and you have been all over the place. And you have received like 35 journalistic awards. Once I read you beat Anderson Cooper in receiving one journalistic award. And that, as a Latino, makes me feel proud. Tell me about that turning point and how were you able to reinvent yourself into this area?
So because I had dealt with so much pain and trauma, that really made me very empathetic to other people who have been through traumatic experiences. And I realized while I was recovering from sports that what I wanted to do was tell stories about people who were victims or survivors of other traumatic experiences. What had happened was, after Monday Night Football, I had an opportunity to be on the cover of Playboy magazine at 41 years old. And they had come to me many times to ask me to pose for the magazine. And I said, no, I'm a sportscaster. I can never do that. But finally, I was out of work. I didn't have a job. I knew that I wanted to be a reporter, but I didn't know how I was going to go about, having a platform to tell people I wanted to get back to work in news. So I made this incredibly risky decision to go ahead and be on the cover of Playboy. And it made huge news for a couple of reasons. Number one, I was a former Monday Night Football sideline reporter, but also I was 41 years old, which is very old for the cover of Playboy. And I was a Latina. And most of the covers of Playboy are young, blonde American girls. So I was getting a lot of attention from being on that cover. And a show called Inside Edition did a story about me posing on the cover. And I said during the interview that I wanted to work for the show. And they ended up hiring me. They gave me a 2-year contract as a correspondent. And that was 17 years ago. So I've been working for Inside Edition for 17 years. 13 years ago, they promoted me to chief investigative correspondent. And now I've taken all of that pain and all that suffering, and now I turn it towards chasing bad guys on behalf of other people who have experienced pain and suffering. And so now I have found my voice. I have found my purpose. Strangely, it came because of Playboy and Inside Edition. But honestly, it's such a miraculous story. And I wanted to tell it in the book because I almost can't believe it myself. But I know that at the end of the day, I'm doing the right thing and I'm doing good work to help other people.
Una guerrera, de verdad, es lo que es Lisa Guerrero.
Gracias.
Es un caso, there's been a case that you feel more proud about, like many cases, many reports, big stories, but there's something that you feel like, oh, that was my best one.
Yeah, I did a story a few years ago. A woman contacted me on Facebook and she said, you know, my niece was 2 years old and she was beaten to death in her crib. And this was 4 years ago. The local police bungled the case. All 3 adults that were in that house have all escaped to other states, and nobody has solved this case. And, you know, would you look into it? So I asked my producers, can I go investigate this cold case? And they said yes. So I went out to Nebraska, interviewed the detective and the district attorney. Sure enough, this girl was beaten to death in a very small bungalow. So those 3 adults, one of them did it. One of them beat her to death, but the other 2 had to have known who did it. But they were all gone. So my team and I tracked all 3 of those adults down, who are now in different states. And on camera, we got 2 of them to roll over and admit on camera that Dustin Chauncey had beaten Juliette Gertz to death in her crib. So because we aired that story, a grand jury was convened, he was arrested, and I was in the courtroom 2 years later when he was found guilty of killing Juliette Gertz, and he's now spending 80 years to life in prison for killing her.
Wow. Where does the energy come from to still have, you know, that strength and keep going and looking for those stories and looking for the truth? Where does it come from? ¿De dónde sale esa fuerza?
It comes from my mother. It comes from Lisa Guerrero. It comes from her legacy to me. It goes back to that first thing that she told me at the beginning of this conversation. She told me I was a warrior and I was born to fight. So she's not here physically with me today. She passed away when she was 29, but she is with me in spirit. She resides inside me. She is the driving force behind my energy to try to find justice for people. So I look in the mirror now and I see her. I look like a Guerrero. I look like her. I have her name. I took her name legally. I have a wonderful dad, an American dad, who gave me his blessing because he still loves my mother and he knows how proud she would be of me. But I feel like she's the reason I do what I do because I'm a Guerrero and I will always be. And I will always have her spirit because she's right here with me. I named the book for her. She lives in me. And I know she's so proud of this book. And I know she's proud of me and hopefully of our legacy together.
Coming back a little bit to sports, do you like sports? Do you hate sports? Do you feel interested sometimes? Maybe the Rams or not?
I am a huge sports fan, Ricardo. I have always been a sports fan. My dad raised me. After my mother passed away, my dad was a big sports fan, and he taught me the language of sports. And so when we lived in San Diego, before we moved further north, I loved the Chargers and I loved the Padres. And then when we moved up to Orange County, I became a big fan of the Lakers and the Dodgers. And when I became a sports reporter, of course, I got to report and meet Kobe Bryant and Shaquille O'Neal and all of these big stars in sports here in Los Angeles. And so I'm a huge sports fan. But after the trauma that I had with Monday Night Football, I couldn't watch any sports at all for 2 years. I was too devastated to watch sports. But as part of my recovery, I realized that those things that happened to me didn't have to affect my love of the game and my love of sports. So I still go to Rams games and Dodgers games, and I'm a huge fan of all of our Los Angeles teams. But you can often catch me at Dodger Stadium drinking a michelada and eating a Dodger dog and cheering on the Dodgers and of course the Rams too. So I think they have micheladas at SoFi Stadium too. So.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, and it's a nice place to watch sports. You were mentioning earlier about other Hispanic young women and how you want to touch them in the best way and being motivational and inspiring to them. And I'm sure you are. But can you send a message to this Hispanic community that we serve? If you want to do it in Spanglish or English or Spanish, whatever you want.
Oh, my Spanish is terrible. And I will say this, part of the reason I wanted to write the book and deliver this message to all young women, and especially to Latinas, is that a big part of my culture and history was taken away from me when my mom died at 8 years old. I didn't learn Spanish. I took Spanish in high school and got straight A's, but I missed a big part of my culture. And I really regret that. I wish that I had had a sister or an aunt or grandmother here in Los Angeles that could have really taught me how to make my mother's empanadas, or how to speak Spanish conversationally. And as an adult, I've gone back to Chile and I travel a lot around Central and South America and Mexico. So I feel connected to my identity and I feel connected to my heritage. But I would say to young people that have an opportunity to connect with their parents and grandparents, to listen to them, to connect with your heritage, to be proud of your heritage. Right now, we are living in an environment where we're taught to somehow be ashamed of being Latino, that there's something wrong with us, that there's something wrong with our parents for wanting us to have a better life, to come here. We have every right to be here. We have every right to take up space, to live in this community, to own businesses, to go to college, to have whatever job we want. I would say to not pull away from your heritage. In my case, it was taken from me. And I did spend a lot of time later interviewing my grandfather Guerrero and reconnecting with a lot of my family. But if you have them here with you today, I beg you, learn Spanish, learn the culture, be a part of the culture, be proud of who you are, be proud of your heritage. I took my mother's name instead of my father's name because I wanted to connect with my people. And everybody watching this or reading this are my people, all of us. We are part of the fabric of the Latino community here in the United States, no matter what country we're from. We're all the same family. So that's the message I would leave, is to embrace this heritage and embrace your family and listen to the stories of our grandparents.
And in honor of you, in your honor, I will say, chi 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 le le le, viva Chile, the way the Chilean people
Viva
say. Chi 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 le le le, viva Chile. Lisa, finally, I want to ask you if you have any memory of our newspaper, Opinión, when you were growing up in Southern California. This is a newspaper who has served the community for 95 years. It's the most important Spanish newspaper in the country.
I do. I have some. Here's a really interesting memory I have. When I was a sportscaster, young sportscaster in Los Angeles, I would, cover the Dodgers. And because I was a woman, I got there first thing in the morning, and I would be the last one to leave after the games ended because I wanted to learn so much. And the people that would let me into the stadium were Latinos. And they were the security guards, and they were the ushers, and they worked at Dodger Stadium at Chavez Ravine, as you all know. So it was those people that would carry with them La Opinión, and they would have the newspaper, and I would see the newspaper with them and ask them what's being reported. Tell me what's in the paper. What are they saying about the Dodgers? What's going on in politics? And I would chat with the Dodger Stadium workers, many of whom were Mexican, and they would explain to me what was going on in that paper. And to me, it was really interesting too, because it was kind of a mystery, because like I told you, I took Spanish and got straight A's, but I wasn't conversational in it. But it was a way for me to communicate and to connect with my people, with our people. And so I think that the newspaper itself is very meaningful to me in the way that it connected conversations and connected cultures. So I value what you have done in the community for so long, and also how it brings a sense of pride and self and culture to people that need it and deserve it.
Lisa Guerrero, it's an honor and a privilege, and I wish you the best with your book, and I can't wait to read it completely. And thank you for your time being with us.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the platform, and I appreciate your time as well. Thank you, Ricardo.